Imagine you're standing in a museum. Maybe you've been there 100 times. Maybe you dragged your kids there on a rainy Saturday afternoon. And right there in the center of the hall is a map. A map of Africa with a single red dot glowing somewhere near Ethiopia or Kenya. A little arrow sweeps outward from that dot, north into Europe, east into Asia, all the way to the Americas. Neat. Clean, certain. The label underneath reads, Birthplace of Humanity. You've seen it, you've believed it, we all have. Here's the thing, some of the world's leading scientists are now saying that map might be wrong, not slightly off, not missing a few details, fundamentally, structurally wrong. And if that sounds dramatic, good, because it is. For decades, the story of where humans came from seemed settled. It had a name, the Out of Africa theory. It had fossils, it had genetics, it had a tidy timeline. Around 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans appeared somewhere in East Africa. They lived there for hundreds of thousands of years, developing language, tools, art. Then, roughly 70,000 years ago, a small group crossed into the Middle East and began one of the greatest journeys in the history of life on Earth, spreading across every continent, outlasting every other human species, until only we remained. It's a beautiful story, heroic even. But what if it's a myth? What if the evidence we used to build that story was cherry-picked, not deliberately, but because we were only looking in certain places, asking certain questions, and ignoring the data that didn't fit the narrative? In 2017, a discovery in a cave in Morocco didn't just challenge the Out of Africa theory, it detonated it. Human fossils, anatomically modern, dated to 315,000 years ago, over 100,000 years older than what the textbooks said was possible, found not in East Africa, but in the northwest corner of the continent, thousands of miles from where we thought humanity was born. And that was just the beginning, because since then, the anomalies have kept piling up. Fossil evidence of modern humans appearing in the Middle East more than 180,000 years ago, way before the supposed exodus. Archaeological sites in China suggesting human activity that predates what the theory allows. Genetic studies revealing that our ancestors were interbreeding with other human species, not just once, but repeatedly, across multiple continents, across hundreds of thousands of years. The tidy red dot on that museum map, it was never the whole story. So what is the whole story? That's what we're here to find out. And I'll warn you now, it's messier, stranger, and far more extraordinary than anything that fits inside a single red dot on a map. My name is David Attenborough, and today we're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere nobody expected, especially then. There's something deeply human about wanting to know where you came from. Not just your parents or your grandparents, or even the village your great-great-grandmother was born in somewhere across an ocean. I mean the deep origin. The original question, the one that has haunted philosophers, priests and scientists for as long as we've been capable of asking it. Where did we come from? For most of human history, the answer came from mythology. Creation stories, divine breath, sacred mud, the first man, the first woman, placed on earth by forces beyond comprehension. These stories weren't just explanations, they were comfort. A way of making the terrifying randomness of existence feel intentional, meaningful, designed. Then science came along and did what science always does. It looked at the evidence. And the evidence, slowly, painstakingly, over centuries of fossil hunting and laboratory analysis and fierce academic debate, pointed somewhere very specific. Africa, East Africa, to be precise. The Great Rift Valley, that ancient geological scar running thousands of miles down the eastern spine of the continent, became our Eden. Not the mythological one, but something arguably more miraculous. A real place, a documented place. A place where the bones of our ancestors had been waiting in the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, patient as stone, until the right person with the right tools came along to find them. And for decades, the story built from those bones was extraordinary in its clarity. Let me walk you through it, because to understand why the new discoveries are so revolutionary, you first have to understand just how convincing the old story was, how solid it seemed. How every piece of evidence appeared to lock into every other piece with the satisfying click of a puzzle coming together. It begins, as so many stories do, with a discovery. In the 1970s and 80s, researchers working in the Homo region of Ethiopia pulled fossil remains from the Earth that would eventually be dated to approximately 195,000 years ago. These weren't primitive, brutish skulls. They were, by the standards of paleontology, startlingly modern: high foreheads, reduced brow ridges, rounded brain cases. The kind of skull that, if you cleaned it up and placed it on a shelf in an anatomy classroom, your students might not immediately flag as ancient at all. Then in 1997, a team working at a site called Irhoud, also in Ethiopia, found another skull. This one dated to around 160,000 years ago, again modern. Recognizably human in a way that earlier species, like Homo erectus or the older Australopithecus, simply were not. Here, the fossil records seem to be saying something clear. This is where it happened, right here. Eastern Africa, around 200,000 years ago, and the scientific community listened. But fossils alone don't tell a complete story. Bones tell you what something looked like, roughly when it lived, and sometimes how it died. What they can't tell you, at least not directly, is how populations were connected, how they moved, how they related to each other across generations and millennia. For that, you need genetics. In the 1980s, a team of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, did something that, at the time, seemed almost impossibly ambitious. They decided to trace the ancestry of every human being on Earth using a single type of genetic material. They chose mitochondrial DNA, a small circular strand of genetic code that lives not in the cell nucleus, but in the mitochondria, the ancient energy-producing structures inside every one of your cells. What makes mitochondrial DNA special and scientifically invaluable is how it's inherited. Unlike the DNA in your chromosomes, which gets shuffled and recombined with each generation, mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost exclusively from mother to child, unchanged. Generation after generation after generation. This means it carries a kind of molecular timestamp, a record of maternal lineage stretching back through time without the noise of recombination clouding the signal. The Berkeley team, led by Alan Wilson, Rebecca Cann, and Mark Stoneking, collected mitochondrial DNA samples from people across the globe: Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, the Americas. Every major population group they could reach. They then analyzed the sequences, looking for variations, tiny mutations that accumulate slowly and predictably over time, like molecular tick marks on a clock. What they found made headlines around the world. Every single mitochondrial DNA sequence, from every human being tested, traced back to a single common ancestor, one woman, living in Africa, roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. The press went wild. They called her Mitochondrial Eve, a name that was scientifically imprecise but narratively irresistible. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time, of course. She was simply the only woman whose unbroken matrilineal line of descent survived to the present day. All other female lineages from her era eventually hit a dead end, a generation with no daughters, a family line snuffed out by circumstance or catastrophe. But her line made it. And every human alive on Earth today carries a piece of her. The implication was staggering. All of us, every person reading this, every person who has ever walked the streets of Tokyo or Buenos Aires or Lagos or London, descends through an unbroken chain of mothers from a single woman who lived in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. That's not metaphor, that's not mythology, that's molecular biology. But the genetic evidence didn't stop at Mitochondrial Eve. It kept going, kept building, kept constructing a picture so internally consistent that dismissing it seemed almost willfully obstinate. Here's one of the most compelling pieces: genetic diversity. When researchers mapped out the genetic variation in different human populations around the world, the variety of different gene variants, or alleles, present in each group, they found a pattern so clear it practically announced its own explanation. African populations had the most genetic diversity. More variation, more different gene versions, more genetic complexity than any other population on Earth. European populations had less, Asian populations had less still. And Native American populations, the people whose ancestors had migrated furthest from Africa, across Siberia and into the Americas, had the least genetic diversity of any major human group on Earth. Think about what this means for a moment. If all humans originated in Africa and then spread outward in a series of migrations, you'd expect exactly this pattern. Each time a small group breaks off from a larger population and moves somewhere new, they take only a fraction of the original group's genetic diversity with them, a phenomenon geneticists call the founder effect. Then, when another small group breaks off from that group to move even further, they carry an even smaller fraction. Africa to the Middle East to Europe and Asia. Asia to the Americas. Each step a little less diversity. Like making photocopies of photocopies, each generation loses a little resolution from the original. The data fit the theory with stunning precision. The further a population lived from Africa, the less genetic diversity they carried. The numbers lined up, the pattern held. It wasn't a rough correlation, it was a near-perfect gradient, exactly what you'd predict from a single point of origin in Africa, followed by serial migrations outward. This was the genetic evidence. And it was formidable. Then there was the archaeology. And if the fossils built the foundation and the genetics poured the concrete, the archaeology was the architecture that made the whole structure feel like a home. Researchers working at sites across sub-Saharan Africa kept turning up evidence of what scientists call modern cognitive behavior. Symbolic thinking, artistic expression, the kind of abstract reasoning that separates us from every other species that has ever lived. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, they found pieces of ochre, a reddish-brown mineral, engraved with geometric patterns. Deliberately, intentionally, meaningfully. These engravings dated to roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. They weren't functional. They weren't tools. They were something else entirely. The earliest known evidence of humans making marks for reasons beyond pure survival. Art, in other words, or something very close to it. At nearby sites they found shell beads, tiny perforated shells that had clearly been strung together and worn as jewelry. Not for warmth, not for protection, for adornment, for identity. For the deeply human desire to say, this is who I am, this is what I belong to, this is how I want to be seen. These behaviors, symbolic thought, artistic expression, personal ornamentation, were the cognitive fingerprints of modern humanity. And in Africa, they appeared tens of thousands of years before showing up anywhere else on Earth. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux in France. Beautiful beyond description, but only about 17,000 years old. The elaborate blade tools of Upper Paleolithic Europe? They appeared in Africa first, sometimes by 30,000 to 40,000 years. Every time researchers found evidence of modern human cognition and behavior outside of Africa, they found it appearing earlier inside Africa. The message seemed unambiguous. Modern humanity, biologically and behaviorally, was born in Africa. It developed there. It matured there. And then it spread outward to the rest of the world, carrying its tools, its symbols, its extraordinary cognitive capacity, and eventually its civilizations. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the out-of-Africa theory wasn't just the dominant explanation for human origins. It was, for all practical purposes, considered settled science. The kind of thing you listed in the textbook without a question mark, the kind of thing you built museum exhibits around, the kind of thing that shaped national identity narratives, informed debates about race and diversity, and gave humanity a foundational story it could anchor itself to. We came from Africa, one place, one origin, one shared beginning. It was genuinely a beautiful idea, not just scientifically but philosophically. If we all trace back to the same small population, on the same continent, at roughly the same time, then every distinction we've constructed between ourselves, every border and barrier and category we've invented to divide ourselves from each other, is even more arbitrary than we imagined. We're not just vaguely related, we're practically cousins. The science and the humanism seemed perfectly aligned, which made what happened next so uncomfortable. Because the more researchers looked, the more fossils they dug up, the more genomes they sequenced, the more archaeological sites they excavated, the more the perfect story started showing. Imperfections. Small ones at first, easy to explain away, maybe a misdated fossil, maybe a fringe genetic result that would be corrected by the next study. Maybe an archaeological site that was misinterpreted, but the imperfections kept accumulating, and by the mid-2010s they were no longer small, they were enormous, undeniable. And they were pointing somewhere no one expected. The story wasn't wrong, exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth, not even close. And as we're about to see, the truth was stranger, older, and infinitely more complex than a single red dot on a map could ever capture. Science rarely collapses all at once. It doesn't wake up one morning, look in the mirror, and announce that it's been wrong. That's not how it works. What actually happens is slower, quieter, and in many ways more unsettling. Anomalies appear, little pieces of evidence that don't quite fit the framework. Researchers notice them, note them, and then almost inevitably find reasons to set them aside. Probably a dating error, probably contamination, probably an outlier. And for a while, that's fine. Every theory has anomalies. Science is messy. You don't throw out a well-supported model because of a handful of inconvenient data points. You keep the model, flag the outliers, and wait for more evidence. But what happens when the outliers keep multiplying? When the anomalies become so numerous, so consistent, so geographically distributed that they're no longer outliers at all, they're a pattern. That's when things get interesting. And that's exactly what happened to the out of Africa theory. The first major crack didn't come from Africa. It came from a cave in Israel. Mislia Cave, perched on the western slope of Mount Carmel, had been an excavation site for years. Researchers working there had found stone tools, animal bones, evidence of fire, the standard archaeological fingerprints of human occupation. But in 2018, they announced a finding that sent shockwaves through the paleoanthropology community: a human jaw, specifically a partial upper jawbone with teeth still intact. The bone was anatomically modern. The shape of the teeth, the structure of the jaw, it was us, unambiguously Homo sapiens. And it dated to between 177,000 and 194,000 years ago. Pause on that for a second. The out of Africa theory, in its classic form, held that modern humans left Africa around 70,000 years ago. Some models pushed that back slightly, maybe 90,000 or 100,000 years. But here was a definitively modern human jaw sitting in Israel, more than 5,000 kilometers from East Africa, at least 80,000 years before the supposed exodus. How do you explain that? The theory's defenders had an answer ready: failed migrations. Maybe there were earlier waves of Homo sapiens that ventured out of Africa before the main event, only to die out, leaving no descendants in modern populations. The fossil at Mislia might represent one of these dead ends, a pioneering group that headed north, got partway through the Middle East, and then was wiped out by a climate shift, a disease, competition from Neanderthals, or just plain bad luck. It was a reasonable explanation, uncomfortable but defensible. Except that Miss Leah wasn't alone. At School and Kovze, also in Israel, researchers had previously found modern human remains dated to between 90,000 and 120,000 years ago again. Modern anatomy. Again, well outside the supposed window for African exodus. Again filed under early failed migration and set aside. In China, the situation was becoming similarly awkward. Fossil sites at Jirendong, Fuyan Cave, and Daoxian had turned up teeth and jaw fragments that looked anatomically modern, dating to between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago. That's 10,000 to 50,000 years before the mainstream theory said modern humans arrived in East Asia. And it wasn't just the fossils. The stone tools were telling a complicated story too. Researchers found sophisticated tool technologies appearing in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and even Australia at dates that required modern humans to have been moving around the world far earlier than the classic model permitted. Some Australian archaeological sites suggested human presence as far back as 65,000 years ago, which, if you work backward through the likely migration routes, implies people were leaving Africa considerably earlier than 70,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Each individual anomaly could be explained away, but together they were starting to draw an outline of a picture that looked very different from the one on the museum wall. Then came the genetics. And this is where things got not just complicated, but genuinely, thrillingly strange. In 2010, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology did something that had seemed impossible just a decade earlier. They sequenced the genome of a Neanderthal. Not a living Neanderthal. Neanderthals had been extinct for roughly 40,000 years, but a Neanderthal reconstructed from ancient DNA extracted from fossil bones. The result was expected to confirm what the out-of-Africa theory implied, that modern humans and Neanderthals were separate species who had met, competed, and parted ways without significant interbreeding. We replaced them. We didn't mix with them. The bloodlines stayed clean. Instead, Pääbo's team found something that fundamentally rewrote the relationship between our species and every other human group we'd ever encountered. Neanderthal DNA was present in modern human genomes, not in tiny negligible amounts that might represent contamination or statistical noise. In meaningful, heritable proportions, typically between 1% and 4% in people of non-African descent, and not randomly scattered through the genome either. The Neanderthal DNA that survived in modern humans tended to cluster in genes related to immune function, skin biology, metabolism. It hadn't just gotten into our genomes by accident. Natural selection had apparently kept it there because it was useful. This wasn't a contamination error. This was interbreeding. Real, consequential, evolutionarily significant interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, the supposedly separate, supposedly outcompeted, supposedly replaced other human species. The classic replacement narrative, the story where modern humans swept out of Africa and displaced every other human group without mixing, had just been dealt a serious blow, but Pääbo wasn't done. That same year, an extraordinary thing happened in a cave in Siberia. A tiny fragment of finger bone, found in Denisovan cave in the Altai Mountains, was sent for genetic analysis. The researchers expected it to come back as either modern human or Neanderthal. Those were the options. Those were the only two kinds of humans anyone seriously expected to find in Siberia 50,000 years ago. What they got instead was something else entirely. The genome extracted from that finger bone didn't match modern humans. It didn't match Neanderthals. It was a third, previously unknown human species, one that had lived alongside both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals without anyone knowing they existed until a scrap of bone yielded its genetic secrets. In a laboratory, they named them Denisovans. And then, here's where it gets really extraordinary, researchers found their DNA in modern humans too. Not in Europeans, not in Africans. but in specific populations in Melanesia and Aboriginal Australia, who carry between 4% and 6% Denisovan ancestry. People in Tibet carry a specific Denisovan gene variant that helps them survive at high altitude, a trait they inherited not from their modern human ancestors, but from a completely different human species they interbred with somewhere along the way. Think about what this means. We found the Denisovans not by digging up their bones, we found them by reading their genetic echo in living people. A species we hadn't even known existed was discovered inside the genomes of people alive today. And if that was true of the Denisovans, the question immediately arose, what else was in there? The answer, it turned out, was more than anyone had bargained for. As geneticists developed more sophisticated tools for analyzing ancient DNA and comparing it against modern genomes, they started finding signatures that didn't match any known human species. Stretches of DNA in modern African populations that appeared to come from an archaic human group, one that had diverged from the main human lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago, but whose fossils had never been found. Researchers called them ghost populations, unnamed, unidentified, physically invisible, present only as a genetic whisper in the chromosomes of their descendants. One study found evidence of a ghost population contributing to the genomes of present-day West Africans. Another found signals of unknown archaic ancestry in Central African forest dweller populations. Each new study seemed to add another shadow to the family tree, another branch that had existed, interbred with our ancestors, and then disappeared without leaving a single bone for us to find. The clean narrative of human origins was becoming something considerably more complicated. Not a tree with a single trunk and spreading branches, but something more like a thicket, tangled, interconnected, with roots reaching in unexpected directions and branches that intertwined and separated and intertwined again across hundreds of thousands of years. And here's what made all of this so significant, beyond the sheer scientific fascination of it all. It wasn't just challenging the specific details of the out-of-Africa theory, it was challenging the fundamental model of how human evolution worked. The classic model was essentially a replacement model. Modern humans appear in one place, develop their superior cognitive toolkit, leave and displace every other human population they encounter. Other species, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, whoever else was out there, go extinct. We survive, we thrive. End of story. But the emerging evidence was telling a different story entirely. It was saying that what actually happened was mixture, connection, exchange, that modern humans didn't simply walk past other human groups on their way to global dominance, they stopped, they met. They lived alongside each other long enough to have children together, and those children carried genes from both lineages. And those genes survived, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of years, sometimes right into the present. That's not replacement, that's something closer to absorption. Something closer to the way that human societies have always worked, not through the obliteration of one group by another, but through contact, exchange, and the messy, complicated business of living. Alongside other people, the anomalies weren't errors in the data. They were signals from a reality far more complex than our theory had accounted for. And the biggest signal of all was still coming. In 2017, in a cave in Morocco, a team of researchers would pull something out of the earth that wouldn't just challenge the out-of-Africa theory. It would force the entire field to sit down, take a breath, and reconsider everything. That discovery is where we're going next. Jebel Irhoud is not a glamorous name. It doesn't roll off the tongue the way Old Dubai Gorge does, or carry the mythic weight of the Great Rift Valley. It's a limestone cave system in the foothills of Morocco, in a region of scrubby, semi-arid terrain that doesn't feature prominently in most people's mental map of where important things happen. But in June of 2017, Jebel Irhoud became the most important place in the world. That was when a team of researchers led by Jean-Jacques Hublin, a paleoanthropologist at the Max Planck Institute, published their analysis of fossils recovered from the site. Not new fossils, exactly. Some of the bones had actually been discovered decades earlier, in the 1960s, when the site was being mined for barite. Workers had pulled them out of the rock and handed them over to researchers who looked at them, scratched their heads, and filed them away in the archaic human, probably early Homo sapiens, unclear, category. They were odd bones. They didn't fit neatly into any established narrative, so they sat in a drawer. Hublin's team went back to the site. They excavated more carefully. They found additional fossils, more skull fragments, more jawbones, stone tools, animal bones bearing evidence of human butchery. And then they dated everything using the most modern, precise methods available. The results stopped to the Paleoanthropology world cold, 315,000 years old. Not 200,000, not 250,000. 315,000 years old. To appreciate why those numbers were so shocking, you need to remember what the out-of-Africa theory was built on. Its cornerstone, the date that everything else in the narrative organized around, was the age of the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils. And those fossils, the ones from Homo kibish in Ethiopia, were dated to approximately 195,000 to 200,000 years ago. That date established the timeline. If the oldest modern humans were about 200,000 years old, then our species was about 200,000 years old. Everything that followed, the development of modern behavior, the out-of-Africa migration, the peopling of the globe, all of it was mapped onto a timeline anchored by that number. And now here were fossils from Morocco, from the opposite side of Africa, over 6,000 kilometers from Ethiopia, that pushed the origin of anatomically modern humans back by over 100,000 years. That's not a minor revision. That's not a tweak to the model. That's an earthquake. But let's be precise about what Hublin's team actually found, because the details matter enormously, both for understanding the discovery and for understanding the debate it ignited. The Jebel Irhoud skulls were not, by anyone's assessment, identical to the skulls of people walking around today. They had modern faces, the forehead, cheekbones, upper jaw. The region scientists call the facial skeleton was strikingly like ours. But the back of the skull, the brain case, was more elongated, more archaic-looking, less rounded than modern human skulls, more like the skulls of earlier Homo species. What Hublin described was a mosaic, a combination of modern and archaic features that suggested these individuals were at, or very near, the base of the Homo sapiens lineage. Not the finished product of our evolution, but not far from it. An early form of our species, displaying many, but not all of the anatomical characteristics that define modern humans. And here's what makes this so significant. Those mosaic features suggest that the evolution of modern humans wasn't a single event that happened in one place at one time. It was a process. A gradual accumulation of modern traits across populations that were spread across a vast geographic range. Because if there were already recognizably Homo sapiens-like people in Morocco 315,000 years ago, and recognizably Homo sapiens people in Ethiopia 200,000 years ago, and evidence of people behaving in modern ways across southern Africa even earlier, then the picture isn't one of a species emerging in a single location and spreading outward. It's a picture of a species emerging across an entire continent. Simultaneously, the stone tools found alongside the Jebel Irhoud fossils added another layer of complexity. They were Middle Stone Age tools, technically sophisticated, carefully crafted, the same broad technological tradition found across Africa during the same period. Which means the people at Jebel Irhoud weren't isolated. They weren't a unique local population doing something different from everyone else. They were part of a continental network, connected through pathways of trade and migration and occasional contact to other populations across Africa, sharing technologies, possibly sharing genes. Evolving together across distances toward what we would eventually recognize as modern humanity. This was the idea that Hublin and his colleagues were proposing. Not a single cradle. Not a single birthplace. Instead, something they described as multiple African populations connected by a web of gene flow, exchanging DNA, exchanging culture, co-evolving across the length and breadth of the continent. Africa wasn't the birthplace of humanity. Africa was humanity, the whole continent, for hundreds of thousands of years. The scientific community's reaction was, as you might expect, a mixture of excitement and vigorous debate. Some researchers embraced the new framework enthusiastically. It explained anomalies that had been nagging at the field for years. It accounted for the mosaic nature of early human fossils across Africa, why some looked more modern in some features, more archaic in others, in different proportions at different sites. It fit the genetic evidence of deep African population structure. The evidence that African populations had been separated and reconnected across long time scales. Others pushed back. The skeptics had legitimate concerns. Dating methods, while vastly improved, are not infallible. The thermoluminescence dating used on the Jebel Irhoud tools, which measures the accumulated radiation dose in the crystal structure of heated flint, is reliable but not immune to error. Could the dates be off? Some researchers also questioned whether the Jebel Irhoud individuals should be classified as Homo sapiens at all. Their elongated brain cases were genuinely different from modern humans. Maybe they weren't early Homo sapiens, but rather a closely related population. Perhaps what some researchers called Homo sapiens adultu, or perhaps something else entirely. The classification debates were real and substantive, not just semantic quibbling, and the Pan-African model itself raised questions. If modern humans were emerging simultaneously across the entire African continent for hundreds of thousands of years, why did they eventually all converge on the same anatomical form? What were the mechanisms that kept these widely separated populations connected enough to evolve in the same direction? These were serious scientific questions. They deserved serious scientific attention, and they got it. But here's the thing about the criticism. While specific aspects of the Jebel Irhoud interpretation were debated, the core finding 315,000-year-old fossils with recognizably modern human features in northwest Africa was not seriously contested. The dates held up under scrutiny. Multiple independent analyses confirmed them. The morphology of the fossils was real. And once you accept that reality, a chain of logical consequences is very difficult to escape. If Homo sapiens, or something extremely close to Homo sapiens, existed 315,000 years ago in Morocco, then our species is at least 115,000 years older than the classic out-of-Africa theory assumed. The timeline doesn't just shift, it shatters. If a modern-ish human population existed in northwest Africa 315,000 years ago, and another existed in East Africa 200,000 years ago, and there's evidence of modern behavior in South Africa going back even further, then the idea of a single East African origin point becomes extraordinarily difficult to defend. And if the origin wasn't a single point but a continental process, if what we call Homo sapiens emerged from the mixing and gradual convergence of multiple African populations over hundreds of thousands of years, then the question, where did humans come from, suddenly has a very different answer than the one on the museum map. It's not a red dot, it's an entire continent. Ancient, diverse, complex beyond our prior imagination. The Jebel Irhoud discovery was a watershed moment, but it wasn't the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which researchers stopped trying to fit the evidence into the old narrative and started building a new one from scratch. That new narrative is extraordinary. It involves multiple populations, hundreds of thousands of years of interaction, interbreeding with species we barely knew existed, migrations that went in multiple directions across multiple timescales, and a picture of human diversity that makes the old story look like a rough sketch compared to a detailed portrait. It's messier, it's more complicated. It requires more intellectual humility than a single red dot demands. But it's also, in the most profound sense of the word, truer. And truth, even complicated, uncomfortable, map-rewriting truth, is always worth following. In Chapter 2, we're going to follow it all the way to where it leads into the Pan-African model, into the Neanderthal bedrooms, into the ghost populations that left their fingerprints in our DNA without ever leaving a bone for us to find, into a vision of human origins so rich, so tangled, so deeply surprising, that it will change how you see every human face you encounter from this moment forward. Because that's what's at stake here. Not just an academic debate about fossils and dates and genetic models. Something far more personal than that. A new answer to the oldest question we've ever asked. Where did we come from? Let's play a thought experiment. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a vast ancient forest. Not the kind of forest you might walk through on a Sunday afternoon. A managed, tidy woodland with marked trails and car parks at the entrance. I mean a real ancient forest. Dense, trackless, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. No roads, no signs, no maps. Now imagine that somewhere inside that forest there's a single tree. A very special tree, the one that all the other trees in the forest descended from the original ancestor. The source, for decades, that's how we thought about human evolution. Somewhere in the forest of African prehistory, there was one tree, one population, one source. Find the tree, find the origin, solve the mystery. But what if that's entirely the wrong way to think about it? What if there was never one tree? What if, instead, the whole forest was the point, a vast, ancient, interconnected ecosystem where hundreds of populations grew alongside each other, where branches from different trees occasionally reached across the gap and intertwined, where the forest itself was the origin, not any single tree within it? That's what the new science of human origins is telling us. And it's not just a poetic metaphor, it's a precise, evidence-based description of how our species actually came to exist. The name for this new framework is Pan-African evolution. And once you understand it, the story of where humans came from will never look the same again. To understand Pan-African evolution, you first need to understand something about Africa itself. Because one of the subtle errors embedded in the old out-of-Africa model was a kind of unconscious geographical compression, a tendency to talk about Africa as if it were a single environment, a uniform backdrop against which human evolution played out. It isn't. It never was. Africa is the second largest continent on Earth, covering more than 30 million square kilometers. Within that space, you find some of the most dramatically varied environments on the planet. The vast Sahara Desert, which crucially wasn't always a desert. During periods of higher rainfall, the Green Sahara was a landscape of rivers, lakes and grasslands teeming with wildlife and, as we're increasingly discovering, with people. The Congo Basin, the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, so dense and complex it effectively isolated the populations living in and around it. The East African savanna, with its open grasslands and reliable seasonal patterns. The Mediterranean climate fringes of the north and south. The semi-arid Kalahari. The temperate highlands of Ethiopia. These are not variations on a theme. They are fundamentally different worlds. Different climates, different plants, different animals, different food sources, different pressures, different challenges, and critically they were not static. Over hundreds of thousands of years, Africa's environments shifted dramatically in response to cycles of glaciation, changes in the Earth's orbital patterns, and the complex feedbacks of the global climate system. Deserts expanded and contracted, forests grew and retreated, grasslands spread and shrank, river systems appeared and disappeared. What this means for human evolution is profound. Populations living in different parts of Africa weren't just adapting to different environments. They were adapting to environments that kept changing around them, forcing constant adaptation, constant movement, constant contact with other groups as climate shifts pushed people toward the same refugia or opened new corridors between previously separated regions. This is the canvas on which the Pan-African evolution model is painted. not a single dot. A dynamic, shifting, continent-wide tapestry of human populations, separated, connected, separated again, exchanging genes and culture across timescales that dwarf recorded history. The first serious scientific articulation of this model came from a 2018 paper in the journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution, authored by Eleanor Skerry and a team of researchers from institutions across Europe and Africa. The paper was titled, "Did Our Species Evolve in Subdivided Populations Across Africa? And Why Does It Matter?" The question in the title was rhetorical. Skerry's answer was an unambiguous yes. What Skerry and her colleagues argued, drawing on fossil evidence, genetic data, and archaeological findings, was that the fossil record of early Homo sapiens across Africa shows a consistent pattern, different populations living in different regions, displaying different combinations of modern and archaic features. Not one population gradually becoming more modern over time, but multiple populations, each evolving along their own trajectory, occasionally exchanging genes when environmental conditions allowed. Contact, then separating again as conditions changed. Think of it as a mosaic not just within individual fossils, but across the entire continent. In East Africa, populations developing some features of modernity. In South Africa, populations developing others. In North Africa, still other combinations. Each regional group living largely in isolation for long periods. Each accumulating local adaptations, each carrying its own version of what it meant to be Homo sapiens. And then, when the climate opened corridors, when river systems expanded into previously arid zones, when grasslands spread and connected previously separated regions, these populations would come into contact. They would interact. They would sometimes interbreed. Genes from the South African populations would flow into East African ones. Genes from North African populations would travel south. The modern features that had developed independently in different regions would combine, recombine, and gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, converge on the anatomy and cognition we recognize as fully modern. There was no single moment when Homo sapiens appeared, no single location where the species was born. Instead, there was a long, slow pan-continental process of becoming a species, assembling itself from the contributions of multiple populations across the length and breadth of the world's most ancient and complex landmass. The fossil evidence for this model is striking once you know what to look for. Consider the range of early Homo sapiens fossils across Africa and what they actually look like. The Jebel Irhoud individuals from Morocco, 315,000 years old, with their modern faces but archaic, elongated brain cases. The Florisbad skull from South Africa, possibly around 260,000 years old, with a combination of modern and primitive features that doesn't match either the archaic humans that came before or the fully modern humans that came after. The Homo kibish fossils from Ethiopia, around 195,000 years old, where two individuals found at the same site looked noticeably different from each other, one more modern, one more archaic, suggesting they came from populations with different evolutionary histories. In the old model, these variations were awkward. If all modern humans descended from a single East African population, why did early Homo sapiens look so different from each other across the continent? Why did some populations retain archaic features while others developed modern ones? Why was the earliest clearly modern skull found in East Africa 195,000 years ago, while a jaw from Morocco with modern features was 315,000 years old? The Pan-African model doesn't just accommodate these variations, it predicts them. If modern humans emerged from multiple regional populations evolving in parallel, each under different environmental pressures, each developing different combinations of modern traits, then you'd expect exactly this kind of mosaic variation across the fossil record. You'd expect different populations to look somewhat different from each other because they were evolving somewhat independently, even as they were occasionally connected by gene flow. The variations aren't anomalies, they're the signal. The genetic evidence aligns with this picture in ways that are frankly remarkable. For years, geneticists had noticed that African populations contain unusual amounts of deep genetic diversity, variation, that traces back not hundreds of thousands of years, but over 1 million years. This was puzzling under the classic out-of-Africa model. If all modern humans descended from a relatively small East African population around 200,000 years ago, why did African genomes contain lineages that stretched back so much further? A 2022 study published in the journal Nature offered a striking answer. The study, led by Aaron Ragsdale and Simon Gravel, modeled the demographic history of modern African populations using data from thousands of individuals across the continent. Their best fit model wasn't a single ancestral population splitting into regional groups. It was something far more complex, multiple populations that had been partially isolated from each other for hundreds of thousands of years, occasionally exchanging genes through periods of contact, but maintaining distinct identities for immense stretches of time. The model suggested that the ancestors of modern humans were never one unified population. They were always multiple populations, structured, separated, occasionally connected, evolving across the African continent in a pattern that bore much more resemblance to the Pan-African model than to the classic out-of-Africa narrative, and one element of the genetic evidence was particularly striking. The study found signatures consistent with gene flow between early modern human populations and more archaic African hominins, groups that had diverged from the main Homo sapiens lineage, potentially. More than 1 million years ago, these weren't Neanderthals or Denisovans. These were unknown, unnamed African archaic humans, ghost populations, leaving their genetic mark on our ancestors long before the out-of-Africa migration that supposedly defined our species. The family tree wasn't a tree, it was a braided river, multiple channels, sometimes separate, sometimes merging, running in parallel across vast stretches of time. The archaeological record tells the same story, in the language of stone tools and ochre and shell beads and hearths. One of the most important patterns researchers have identified is what they call cultural flickering, rather than a smooth linear progression from simple to complex technologies. The kind of clean, developmental arc the old model implied. The African archaeological record shows a much more dynamic pattern. Sophisticated technologies appear at one site, then disappear, then reappear thousands of years later or hundreds of kilometers away. Advanced symbolic behaviors, personal ornamentation, engraved geometric patterns, complex pigment processing show up at some sites before disappearing from the record entirely, only to re-emerge. Later, this flickering pattern doesn't make sense if you imagine a single population developing a technological tradition and passing it down continuously to their descendants. It makes perfect sense if you imagine multiple regional populations, each capable of developing sophisticated technologies, but doing so intermittently depending on population size, resource availability, and contact with other groups. When populations connected, they shared innovations. When they separated, local traditions might fade. When contact was re-established, ideas and techniques would flow again. This is how human culture has always worked, when you think about it. Not through isolated invention and linear progress, but through exchange, borrowing, adaptation, and the unpredictable spark of contact between different groups with different knowledge. The Middle Stone Age of Africa, spanning roughly from 300,000 to 30,000 years ago, wasn't a single cultural tradition. It was a constellation of regional traditions, overlapping and interacting across the continent, collectively embodying the cognitive and behavioral modernity of an emerging species. What the Pan-African model ultimately asks us to do is something surprisingly difficult: to let go of our instinct for simplicity. We are storytelling creatures. We want beginnings. We want a moment when the curtain rises, a place where the first act opens, a character we can point to as the protagonist. The Out of Africa model gave us all of that. a single location. A definable moment, a coherent narrative arc. Pan-African evolution gives us something messier and more magnificent. It gives us an entire continent as the protagonist. It gives us a process rather than a moment. It gives us complexity where we wanted simplicity, and depth where we craved a clean surface. But here's what it also gives us, a more honest account of what it means to be human. Because if our species was never born in a single place, never descended from a single ancestral community, never had one founding population from which all diversity subsequently flowed, then human. Diversity isn't a deviation from some original template. It's baked into the very origin of our species. It was there from the beginning. We didn't start as one thing and become many. We were always many things, woven together across time and space into something extraordinary. And the weaving didn't stop at Africa's borders. As we'll discover in Part 2, the threads of our ancestry stretch far beyond the continent into the caves of Europe, the highlands of Asia, and across the genetic traces of species we barely knew existed. Here's something no school textbook prepared you for. Right now, sitting inside your genome, woven into the very DNA that makes you you, there are fragments of genetic code that don't belong to Homo sapiens, not technically. Not in the strict species boundary sense. They came from somewhere else, from someone else. From beings who were human enough to look us in the eye, human enough to share a fire with us, human enough to have children with us, but different enough that for decades scientists classified them as an entirely separate species. You are not purely human, none of us are. And that's not a disturbing discovery. It's one of the most extraordinary things science has ever revealed about our nature. Let's go back to 2010 and the moment Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute published their Neanderthal genome paper. We touched on this in Chapter 1, but now we're going to sit with it properly, because the implications deserve more than a mention. Pääbo had been trying to sequence ancient DNA for decades. The challenge is immense. DNA degrades over time, and after tens of thousands of years, what's left in fossil bone is usually badly fragmented, chemically damaged, and contaminated with DNA from bacteria, fungi, and most frustratingly modern humans who handled the specimen during excavation and analysis. Separating genuine ancient human DNA from modern contamination is technically demanding work, and for most of the 20th century it was effectively impossible to do reliably for specimens older than a few thousand years. But by the 2000s, advances in sequencing technology, particularly the development of high-throughput sequencing methods that could read millions of short DNA fragments simultaneously, made the impossible achievable. Pääbo's team used bones from 3 Neanderthal individuals found in Vindija Cave in Croatia, specimens well preserved enough to yield usable genetic material. What they assembled painstakingly over years of work was the first draft sequence of a Neanderthal genome. And when they compared it to modern human genomes, the finding was unambiguous. People of non-African ancestry carry roughly 1% to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Europeans, East Asians, South Asians, Native Americans, anyone whose ancestors left Africa before modern human populations there had time to fully differentiate, all carry this Neanderthal genetic legacy. But people whose ancestry is exclusively sub-Saharan African carry essentially none, which makes perfect sense if the interbreeding happened outside of Africa, after the populations that would become non-Africans had already left the continent, in the Middle East probably, where early modern humans moving north would have encountered Neanderthal populations that had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The two groups met. They coexisted for a period that may have lasted thousands of years. And during that time, some of them had children together. Now, 1% to 4% might not sound like much, but consider what it actually means in practice. First, it means the interbreeding was real and consequential enough to leave a persistent genetic signal tens of thousands of years later. This wasn't a single chance encounter, a genetic accident that happened once and barely left a trace. It was repeated contact, over extended time periods, producing offspring who survived and reproduced and passed those Neanderthal genes down through the generations. Second, and this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, the Neanderthal DNA that survived in modern human genomes isn't randomly distributed. When researchers mapped where Neanderthal sequences appeared across the modern human genome, they found that some regions were enriched for Neanderthal variants, while others showed a striking absence of them. The enriched regions, the places where Neanderthal DNA was common, tended to involve genes related to skin biology, hair follicles, immune function, and metabolism. These were exactly the kinds of genes where Neanderthal variants might have been useful to modern humans moving into the cold, pathogen-rich environments of Ice Age Europe and Asia. Neanderthals had been living in those environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd already done the evolutionary work of adapting to them. When modern humans arrived and acquired Neanderthal genes through interbreeding, they essentially got a biological head start, pre-adapted immune responses, cold-weather skin characteristics, metabolic adjustments that helped them survive in unfamiliar conditions. Evolution, in its characteristically unsentimental way, kept the useful stuff. The depleted regions, the parts of the modern human genome where Neanderthal DNA was notably absent, were equally informative. These tended to involve genes expressed in the male reproductive system and in the brain. The absence in reproductive genes is consistent with what biologists call hybrid incompatibility, when two populations that have been separated long enough to diverge genetically come back together. Their hybrid offspring sometimes have reduced fertility, particularly in males. Natural selection would quickly eliminate those variants from the gene pool. The absence in brain-related genes is more intriguing. It might suggest that the specific cognitive architecture of modern Homo sapiens, whatever it is that makes human minds distinctively human, was not easily compatible with Neanderthal variants in the relevant genes, or it might reflect something else entirely. Researchers are still working through the implications. But the broad picture is clear. Modern humans and Neanderthals weren't simply separate species that replaced each other. They were interbreeding populations whose genetic legacies are still present, still functional, still shaping human biology today. And then there were the Denisovans. We introduced them briefly in Chapter 1, the mysterious third human group discovered from a fragment of finger bone in a Siberian cave. But the Denisovan story has grown considerably richer since that initial discovery, and it deserves to be told in full. The finger bone came from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, and it was remarkable not for what it looked like, a tiny scrap of bone that revealed almost nothing about the physical appearance of its owner, but for what its DNA contained. A genome unlike anything previously sequenced. Not modern human, not Neanderthal. Something that had diverged from the Neanderthal lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago and gone its own evolutionary way. From that same cave, researchers subsequently found a molar tooth, enormous, unlike anything in the modern human dental repertoire, and a toe bone. The tooth's size and shape were so distinctive that, had it been found without DNA analysis, researchers might well have classified it as a completely different species based on morphology alone. Later, from a different site entirely, Baishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters, researchers identified a jawbone using ancient proteins preserved in the bone's structure. DNA was too degraded to recover, but the protein sequences were distinct enough to identify the specimen as Denisovan. Suddenly, Denisovans weren't confined to a single Siberian cave. They had been living on the Tibetan Plateau, one of the most challenging high-altitude environments on Earth. And their DNA turned up in some of the most unexpected places: Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. The populations living at the far end of the human migration trail, in the islands of the southwestern Pacific and the Australian continent, carry between 4% and 6% Denisovan DNA. That's actually more Denisovan ancestry than most populations carry Neanderthal ancestry, which means that when the ancestors of these populations were moving through Southeast Asia and the islands of the Pacific, they encountered Denisovan populations and interbred with them. Substantially, Tibetans carry a specific variant of a gene called EPAS1, a gene involved in regulating the body's response to low oxygen environments at high altitude. This variant is so effective at enabling high-altitude survival that it's present in nearly 90% of Tibetans, compared to almost zero in Han Chinese, their genetic relatives who live at lower elevations. Researchers traced this variant's origin and found something astonishing. It's Denisovan. Tibetans didn't evolve this adaptation independently. They inherited it from Denisovans, who had already spent thousands of years adapting to life on the roof of the world. This is adaptive introgression, the acquisition of beneficial genes from another group through interbreeding. And it's not a genetic curiosity. It's one of the most direct demonstrations available of how interbreeding between different human groups provided genuine, life-saving advantages to the descendants who carried the mixed ancestry. But Neanderthals and Denisovans were only the beginning of the story, because as genetic analysis tools became increasingly sophisticated, researchers started finding traces of ancestry in modern human genomes that didn't match either known archaic group. These were the ghost populations, the unnamed, unclassified, physically invisible human groups who had interbred with our ancestors and left their genetic mark without leaving a single identifiable fossil for us to find. The first major evidence came from studies of West African populations. Researchers analyzing genomes from the Yoruba of Nigeria, the Mende of Sierra Leone, and other West African groups found stretches of DNA that didn't fit the expected pattern for modern Homo sapiens. These stretches appeared to come from a deeply divergent lineage, one that had separated from the ancestors of modern humans, possibly 500,000 years ago or more, and had contributed perhaps 2% to 19% of the ancestry of some West African populations. That's an enormous range of uncertainty, reflecting the difficulty of detecting and quantifying admixture from very ancient, very divergent populations. But the signal was real. Something ancient, something deeply different from modern humans, had contributed to the genomes of West Africans, and whatever that something was, it had done so recently enough, in evolutionary terms, to leave a detectable signal. Within the last 50,000 years or so, by most estimates. We have no idea what they looked like. We have no fossils we can confidently attribute to them. We can't name them or describe their culture or reconstruct their language. They exist only as a statistical shadow in the genomes of their living descendants, a whisper from a world that left almost no other trace. Similar signals have been found in Central African forest-dwelling populations. The Baka, the Biaka, and other groups, who also show evidence of ancestry from unknown archaic populations. Each new study refines the picture slightly, or complicates it, or both simultaneously. The field is moving quickly, and the conclusions are still being tested and debated. But the broad picture is becoming increasingly clear. The interbreeding that shaped modern human genomes wasn't limited to a couple of well-documented encounters with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Outside of Africa, it was a recurring pattern, spanning hundreds of thousands of years on multiple continents, involving multiple human groups, many of whom we haven't found, many of whom we may never find, all of whom left something of themselves inside the living. What does all of this mean for our understanding of human identity? It means that the concept of a pure human lineage, one unbroken thread stretching back to a single ancestral population, is not just scientifically inaccurate. It's biologically incoherent. There is no pure lineage, there never was. Every human population on Earth today is a mosaic, a blend, a meeting point of ancestries that stretch back in multiple directions into a past far more complex than any simple story could capture. The Neanderthal in your genome helped your ancestors survive an Ice Age winter. The Denisovan in the Tibetan genome makes it possible to live above the clouds. The ghost population in the West African genome contributed something. We don't yet know what that was worth keeping across 50,000 years of natural selection. We are not pure. We are something better than pure. We are accumulated. We are the living sum of every encounter, every connection, every improbable union between peoples who were different from each other, but not different enough to prevent the oldest of human impulses. The impulse to reach across the gap and find another person on the other side. And as we're about to discover, that reaching across gaps, that movement, that contact, that restless human urge to go somewhere new and meet whoever was already there, happened not once, not twice, but in a long and complicated series of journeys that bore almost no resemblance to the single clean exodus the classic model described. The migration story, it turns out, was never just one story. It was dozens of them, layered on top of each other across hundreds of thousands of years. That's where we're going next. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you were designing the story of how a species colonized a planet, if you were writing it as fiction, building it as a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, what would it look like? Probably something clean. A founding event, a great migration, one defining moment when the protagonist crossed the threshold, left the familiar world behind, and set out to claim the unknown. That's the story we told ourselves about human origins, the out-of-Africa migration, capital O, capital A, singular and definitive. Around 70,000 years ago, a small group of modern humans crossed the Sinai Peninsula, or perhaps the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, and the rest, as they say, is history. It's a great story. It's also, the evidence now suggests, far too simple. Not wrong in its broad direction. Modern humans did spread from Africa into the rest of the world, and that process did ultimately result in the peopling of every continent on Earth. But the idea that this happened in a single wave, at a single time, as a single coherent event, that version of the story has been dismantled piece by piece, discovery by discovery, until what remains looks less like a clean migration and more like a centuries-long conversation, a back and forth between Africa and the rest of the world that unfolded across multiple chapters, in multiple directions, over time frames that make recorded human history look like an afterthought. The evidence for early, pre-70,000-year-old human presence outside Africa had been accumulating for years before the field was ready to take it seriously. We've already discussed the Mislia cave jaw from Israel, dated to between 177,000 and 194,000 years ago, and the Skull and Kafze fossils, dated to between 90,000 and 120,000 years ago. But those were just the most anatomically obvious examples in China. The evidence was mounting into something impossible to dismiss. A 2015 study published in Nature reported modern-looking teeth from Fuyan Cave in Hunan Province, dated to between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago. Another site, Zhirendong in Guangxi, yielded a lower jaw and teeth with mosaic modern and archaic features, potentially 100,000 years old. Daoxian in Hunan produced modern-looking teeth, possibly dating to around 80,000 to 125,000 years ago. These weren't isolated finds. They represented a pattern of evidence from across southern China, suggesting that anatomically modern or near-modern humans were present in East Asia, tens of thousands of years before the supposed out-of-Africa migration that was supposed to have brought them there. How do you explain fossils of modern-looking humans in China 100,000 years ago if modern humans didn't leave Africa until 70,000 years ago? Under the classic model, there were two options. 1. The Chinese fossils were misdated. 2. They represented an earlier failed migration that left no descendants in living populations. The people who left those bones in Chinese caves died out without issue, and a later, successful migration around 70,000 years ago populated the continent fresh. Both explanations remained technically possible, but they were becoming increasingly strained. The dating methods used at the Chinese sites were multiple and independent. The idea of perpetually failed early migrations, trotted out every time early human fossils appeared in inconvenient locations, was starting to look less like a genuine hypothesis and more like the theoretical escape hatch, a way of saying yes, but it doesn't count to every anomaly that threatened the main narrative, and then the genetics started to close that escape hatch. The key insight came from increasingly sophisticated analyses of the relationships between modern human populations across Asia, Australia, and the Pacific. Researchers studying the genomes of Aboriginal Australians were confronted with a peculiar puzzle. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were among the earliest populations to leave Africa, or at least to reach their current location, with archaeological evidence from Australia suggesting human presence by at least 65,000 years ago and possibly earlier. But when geneticists compared Aboriginal Australian genomes to those of populations in mainland Southeast Asia and East Asia, the relationships didn't quite add up the way a simple serial migration model would predict. If all non-African populations descended from a single wave of migrants who left Africa around 70,000 years ago, then all non-African populations should be equally closely related to each other, more or less compared to their shared relationship with African populations. You'd expect to see a clean tree structure, African populations at the base, then a split between African and non-African, then subsequent splits among non-African populations as they diverged from each other. What researchers actually found was considerably messier. Some analyses suggested that Aboriginal Australians and Papuans were related to groups in South Asia and Southeast Asia in ways that implied separate migration events or source populations. The genetics of populations across South and Southeast Asia contained layers of ancestry that didn't fit neatly into a single founding event. There were signals of multiple source populations, multiple migration waves, multiple episodes of contact and admixture. A 2016 study analyzing genomes from 142 populations across the globe found evidence that the ancestors of Australasian populations, Aboriginal Australians and Papuans, diverged from other non-African populations earlier than would be expected under a single out-of-Africa model. The paper's authors suggested this was consistent with an earlier wave of migration, one that may have left Africa before 70,000 years ago, contributing to the ancestry of modern Australasians. Was this the failed migration of the classic model, reinterpreted as a successful but early migration? Perhaps. But the distinction matters enormously, because if early migrants from Africa reached Australia 65,000 years ago or more, and left descendants who are still there, then the failure framing collapses entirely. That was a successful migration. It just happened earlier than the standard model allowed. The Arabian Peninsula, meanwhile, was yielding archaeological evidence that complicated the migration timeline in a different way entirely. The classic model assumed that the first modern humans to leave Africa traveled north through the Sinai Peninsula into the Levant, the coastal region of the modern Middle East. This made sense geographically. The Sinai was the obvious land bridge between Africa and Asia. But researchers working in the Arabian interior were finding something unexpected. Stone tools, sophisticated, distinctively modern in their design, scattered across what is now the barren landscape of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, dated to periods between 125,000 and 75,000 years ago. Some of these tools were found in regions that today receive almost no rainfall, where survival would be essentially impossible. But during humid periods of the past, the Green Arabia intervals, when monsoon rains extended much further north than they do today, the same landscape would have been a verdant network of rivers, lakes, and grasslands. The implication was striking. Modern humans hadn't just taken one route out of Africa. They had taken multiple routes at multiple times, when environmental conditions allowed. When the Green Arabia intervals opened up lush corridors across the Arabian Peninsula, people followed. When those corridors closed, when the rains retreated and the desert returned, the populations that had moved into Arabia were isolated, either retreating back toward Africa or pushing further into Asia or dying out in place. This wasn't a single migration, it was a series of expansions and contractions, pulses and retreats, driven by the rhythmic oscillation of African and Asian climates. And what about the migrations back into Africa? This is perhaps the most underappreciated element of the new human origins story. Because the classic model was almost entirely focused on movement out of Africa, the Great Exodus, the spreading of humanity across the globe. What it largely ignored was the evidence that movement also went the other direction. Genetic studies of African populations have revealed multiple signals of ancestry from non-African or Near Eastern populations flowing back into Africa at different times. One major event, estimated to have occurred roughly 3,000 years ago, brought Eurasian ancestry into East and even West Africa on a large scale, an event associated with the spread of pastoralism and agriculture from the Fertile Crescent. But there were earlier events too, less well dated and harder to characterize, suggesting that the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world was never a one-way street. People left Africa. People came back. Genes flowed in both directions across the land bridges and sea routes that connected the continent to the rest of the world, across timescales that dwarfed any individual human life or even any individual civilization. The out-of-Africa migration wasn't a departure from Africa to a world that Africa then had no further connection to. It was one phase, an important phase, a transformative phase, in an ongoing bidirectional relationship between the continent that shaped our species and the wider world that our species went on to shape. So let's step back and look at the full picture that's emerging from all of this evidence. Modern humans, or the populations that would eventually give rise to modern humans, were present across Africa by at least 315,000 years ago, and probably earlier. These populations were never fully unified. They were structured, separated by geography and climate, evolving in parallel across different regions of the continent. From very early times, perhaps 200,000 years ago or more, some of these populations were moving beyond Africa's borders, into the Levant, into the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps into Asia. Some of these early excursions produced descendants who eventually contributed to modern non-African populations. Others left no detectable genetic legacy and died out. Along the way, these early travelers encountered other human groups: Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, Denisovans in Asia, unknown archaic populations in Africa and possibly elsewhere, and interbred with them, acquiring genes that were sometimes useful enough to be maintained by natural selection across hundreds of thousands of years. The major expansion of modern humans across the globe, the one that ultimately resulted in the peopling of every continent, appears to have intensified around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago possibly, associated with improved technologies, population growth, or climatic shifts that opened new corridors. But this expansion didn't happen in a vacuum, and it didn't happen cleanly. It layered on top of earlier movements. It incorporated earlier populations. It mixed and merged with what was already there. The result was not replacement, it was transformation. A gradual, geographically complex, genetically rich transformation of the human world, from a diverse collection of regional populations and archaic species into the single, globally distributed, internally diverse species that eventually built every civilization in human history. It was never one story. It was always many stories, running in parallel, occasionally intersecting, slowly braiding together into a single thread. And that thread, that braided, complex, impure, extraordinary thread, is what you carry in your body today. Every cell, every strand of DNA, every gene that makes you capable of feeling wonder at a story like this one. That's what you are made of. Not a single clean origin. A world of origins. And in our final chapter, we're going to ask what that means, not just for science, for us. for how we think about who we are, where we're going, and what the ongoing revolution in human origins research might still have left to reveal. There's a conversation that happens, sooner or later, whenever the science of human origins gets discussed in public. Someone brings up race. Sometimes it's asked carefully, with genuine curiosity. Sometimes it's asked defensively, with an edge of anxiety. Sometimes it's weaponized, grabbed by people who want the science to confirm a worldview they already hold, who are looking for a biological foundation to build their prejudices on. And for a long time, the out-of-Africa theory seemed to provide a clear, unambiguous answer to the racial question. We all came from the same small population in East Africa. We're all essentially identical under the skin. The differences between human groups in appearance, in culture, in language, are superficial variations on a single theme, products of a few tens of thousands of years of separation and local adaptation. We are, at the genetic level, one people. It was a powerful message, a hopeful one, and it was used consciously and deliberately by scientists and educators who understood that the history of race science had been catastrophically, murderously misused, and who wanted to build a bulwark against that misuse, using the most solid empirical foundation available. The problem is that the new science of human origins is considerably more complicated than that simple message suggests. And if we're going to take the evidence seriously, if we're going to follow it wherever it leads, then we need to have the harder, more nuanced conversation that the evidence actually demands. Not because that conversation is comfortable, it isn't, but because the truth understood correctly is a far more powerful argument against racism than any oversimplification could ever be. Let's start with what the new science actually says about human genetic diversity. It says there's a lot of it. Far more than the classic out-of-Africa model predicted, and distributed in patterns that are considerably more complex than a simple gradient from African diversity to non-African homogeneity. The classic model, serial founder effects, populations losing diversity with each migration step away from Africa, isn't wrong exactly. African populations do carry more genetic diversity than non-African populations in the aggregate. The gradient exists, but it's not the whole story, because within Africa, the patterns of genetic diversity are themselves complex in ways the classic model didn't fully capture. The Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, the San, the Kuhuko, and related groups carry some of the most ancient genetic lineages on Earth, lineages that branched off from other human populations, potentially 200,000 years ago or more. They are, in a very specific genetic sense, the most divergent human populations currently living, more genetically distant from other Africans than many African populations are from Europeans or East Asians. The forest-dwelling peoples of Central Africa, the Baka, the Aka, the Biaka, often collectively called pygmies, show evidence of ancient population separations and ghost population admixture that makes their genetic history extraordinarily deep and complex. Some analyses suggest their ancestors were among the earliest lineages to diverge within the modern human family tree. And the ghost population evidence, those unnamed archaic groups whose DNA lives on in West and Central African genomes, adds another layer of complexity. Some African populations may actually carry more archaic admixture than non-African populations, not less. The interbreeding with other human groups wasn't exclusively a non-African phenomenon. It happened throughout the range of early Homo sapiens, including across the African continent itself. What this means is that human genetic diversity isn't a simple story of decreasing variation as you move away from a single African source. It's a complex, multi-layered tapestry, richer, more ancient, and more structurally intricate than any simplified narrative can capture. Now here's where the conversation about race gets genuinely interesting and genuinely important. Race, as a social category, is real. As a biological category, it is not. These two statements are not in contradiction. They describe different things. The social reality of race is undeniable. Across human history and into the present, people have been categorized by appearance, by the color of their skin, the shape of their features, the texture of their hair, and treated differently on the basis of those categories. Those differential treatments have produced real, measurable disparities in wealth, health, education, and life expectancy that persist to this day. The social reality of race has shaped lives and determined fates in ways that no amount of genetic evidence can simply dissolve. But the biological concept of race, the idea that humanity is divided into a small number of discrete, biologically distinct groups that correspond to the racial categories commonly used in human societies, does not hold up to genetic scrutiny, and the new science of human origins makes this clearer than ever. Here's why. The racial categories that have dominated human social thinking broadly, something like African, European, Asian, Indigenous American, are not genetic clusters. They are not the natural divisions that emerge when you analyze human genetic variation without preconceptions. When researchers look at human genetic data without imposing external categories and ask the data to sort itself into groups, it does produce some structure, but the structure doesn't map cleanly onto racial categories. It reflects geography, ancestry, and historical patterns of population movement and isolation in ways that cross-cut racial boundaries at every scale. More importantly, the genetic differences between human populations, whatever way you choose to define those populations, are vastly smaller than the genetic differences within them. Any two randomly chosen humans from different parts of the world are far more genetically similar to each other than either of them is different from a randomly chosen member of their own population. The variation is real. The idea that it defines discrete biological races is not, and the new human origin story makes this even clearer. Because if modern humans didn't emerge from a single ancestral population, but from a network of populations spread across Africa, populations that were sometimes separated, sometimes connected, always exchanging genes at some level, then there was never a moment when humanity was one thing that subsequently divided. We were always variable, always diverse, always a collection of overlapping, interacting lineages rather than a single unified type. The very concept of a racial original form, some pristine ancestral template from which all subsequent diversity derived, dissolves entirely under the light of Pan-African evolution. There was no original template, there was always variation. The diversity of modern humanity isn't a deviation from some original unity. It's a continuation of the diversity that has characterized our lineage from its very beginning. But here's where the conversation has to get more careful, because acknowledging that race isn't a valid biological category doesn't mean that all genetic differences between human populations are meaningless or non-existent. They're not. And pretending they are, in an effort to make a clean, simple argument against racism, is both scientifically dishonest and strategically counterproductive. Because when the oversimplifications get exposed, the entire argument can seem to fall with them. Natural selection has been operating on human populations for as long as there have been human populations, and it has operated differently in different environments, producing genuine, biologically real adaptations to local conditions. The Tibetan EPS1 gene from Denisovan ancestry, enabling life at high altitude. The sickle cell trait, which provides partial protection against malaria and is common in populations with a long history in malaria-endemic regions. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, which evolved independently in several cattle herding populations across Africa and Europe. Variations in skin pigmentation, which track the UV radiation intensity of different environments with remarkable precision. These are real genetic differences between populations. They are the product of natural selection acting on different groups in different environments. They are medically relevant. Understanding them matters for healthcare, for pharmacology, for understanding disease susceptibility. None of them justify racial hierarchies. None of them map onto racial categories in a clean or consistent way. None of them imply that any population is inherently superior or inferior to any other in any general sense. They are specific adaptations to specific environments, no more morally or socially significant than the fact that populations living in high-altitude environments tend to have larger lung capacities, or that populations with a long history of fishing tend to have cultural adaptations to maritime life. The nuanced position, the one that the evidence actually supports, is that human populations do differ genetically in some meaningful ways, that those differences are the product of specific evolutionary histories in specific environments, and that none of those differences constitute evidence for the kind of broad, hierarchical racial categories that have been used to justify discrimination, oppression, and genocide throughout human history. This brings us to one of the darker chapters in the history of science, the story of how evolutionary theory and genetics were misused throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries to construct elaborate pseudo-scientific justifications for racism. It's a history worth knowing. Not to discredit science itself. Science is a method, a way of interrogating evidence, and it's not inherently racist any more than a hammer is inherently violent. But to understand how scientific authority can be misappropriated in service of ideological agendas, and how important it is that scientists communicate their findings with clarity and humility. The racial science of the 19th century took the genuine observation that human populations look different and built elaborate hierarchical frameworks on top of it, ranking populations by supposed intelligence, creativity, moral capacity, and civilizational potential. These frameworks were not derived from evidence. They were derived from the prejudices of their creators, dressed up in scientific language to give them an authority they didn't deserve. The tragedy is not just that this pseudoscience was wrong. It's that it was used to justify policies that caused immeasurable human suffering, from the transatlantic slave trade to colonialism to the Holocaust. When scientific authority is placed behind a false idea, the consequences can be catastrophic. The new science of human origins isn't just correcting the record on where humans came from. It's dismantling, at the most fundamental level, the biological premises on which racial hierarchies were built. If our species emerged from multiple interconnected populations across an entire continent, if we spent hundreds of thousands of years interbreeding with other human groups, absorbing their genes, benefiting from their adaptations, if our diversity is the original condition of our lineage, rather than a subsequent deviation from some pure original type, then the entire framework of racial hierarchy collapses at its foundations. There is no superior race. There is no pure race. There is no founding type from which all other types are degradations. There is only the extraordinarily complex, endlessly fascinating, deeply interconnected family of populations that constitute our species, all of them ancient, all of them adapted, all of them carrying within their genomes the traces of encounters and connections and minglings that stretch back hundreds of thousands of years. In the end, what the new science of human origins offers isn't just a correction to an outdated narrative, it's something more valuable than that. It's a new foundation for human solidarity, one built not on the oversimplification that we're all identical, but on the deeper and more powerful truth that we're all profoundly, intricately connected, that our differences are real, but they're differences of history and adaptation and geography, not of fundamental worth. That every human population on Earth carries something ancient and irreplaceable, something that emerged from a specific encounter between people and place across an immense stretch of time. We are not one people because we came from one place. We are one people because we are woven from each other, because our lineages have been reaching across gaps and finding connections for as long as we have existed. That's not a comfortable simplification. It's something better. It's the truth. And the truth, as we're about to see, is still being discovered in laboratories, in excavation sites, in the genomes of living people and the bones of the long dead, by scientists who have learned to embrace complexity rather than fear it. In 1912, a fossil was discovered in a gravel pit near the village of Piltdown in East Sussex, England, that would become one of the most celebrated and most embarrassing episodes in the history of science. The fossil appeared to be the skull of an early human ancestor, ancient enough to be genuinely significant, modern enough in its cranium to seem like a plausible link in the evolutionary chain. Leading to Homo sapiens, it was announced to enormous fanfare. It was studied, debated, and celebrated for decades. It was incorporated into evolutionary frameworks. It influenced how scientists thought about the trajectory of human evolution for more than 40 years. In 1953, it was exposed as a fraud. Careful re-examination revealed that the Piltdown skull was a composite, a medieval human cranium combined with the jaw of an orangutan, with the teeth filed down and the bone chemically stained to make them look ancient. Someone, it was never definitively established who, had planted a fake fossil, and the scientific community had been fooled for 4 decades. The Piltdown affair is the most dramatic example of science getting it spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. But it's far from the only one. The history of paleoanthropology, the science of human origins, is littered with overconfident claims, premature conclusions, fierce territorial disputes, and findings that seemed certain until they weren't. And rather than seeing this as a reason to distrust science, I want to argue that it's the opposite. The history of how science has gotten human origins wrong, and then corrected itself, is one of the most compelling demonstrations of why the scientific process, for all its messiness, remains the most reliable method humans have ever developed for getting closer to the truth. Why did the out-of-Africa theory become so dominant, so quickly, and hold on so long even as anomalies accumulated? The answer involves several factors, some intellectual, some institutional, some frankly human. On the intellectual side, the theory genuinely was well supported by the evidence available at the time. The Ethiopian fossils were real, the mitochondrial DNA analysis was methodologically sound, the genetic diversity gradient was a genuine pattern in the data. The out-of-Africa theory wasn't speculation dressed up as science. It was a well-constructed hypothesis that made testable predictions and was supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. The problem wasn't that the evidence was fabricated. The problem was that it was incomplete, and incomplete evidence, interpreted through a particular theoretical lens, can produce a picture that feels more complete than it actually is. Scientists, like all humans, have a powerful tendency toward confirmation bias, the tendency to notice and remember evidence that confirms existing beliefs while unconsciously downplaying or ignoring evidence that challenges them. This isn't a character flaw, it's a cognitive tendency so deeply wired into human perception that even trained scientists working in good faith can fall prey to it. You notice the anomaly, file it under probably an error, and move on. You repeat this enough times, and you've constructed a psychological buffer around the theory that insulates it from a fair accounting of the contrary evidence. Add to this the institutional dynamics of academic science. The out-of-Africa theory, by the 1990s and 2000s, had become the consensus view, the position endorsed by the field's most eminent researchers, published in its most prestigious journals, taught in its most respected universities. Challenging a consensus is professionally risky. Young researchers who question established frameworks can find themselves struggling to publish, struggling to get funding, struggling to be taken seriously. The incentive structure of academic science, whatever its many virtues, does not always reward iconoclasm. This isn't corruption, it's sociology. Human institutions, including scientific ones, develop momentum, authority structures, and norms that can slow the uptake of genuinely revolutionary ideas. The historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, famously argued that major scientific revolutions don't happen through the gradual accumulation of contrary evidence. They happen in dramatic shifts, paradigm changes, when the weight of anomaly becomes too great for the existing framework to bear, and the field reorganizes around a new one. The transformation in human origins science that we're living through right now is, by any reasonable measure, a paradigm change in progress. But here's what makes the story ultimately hopeful rather than troubling. The change is happening. The self-correction is working. The anomalies weren't buried. They were published in reputable peer-reviewed journals by researchers who did careful work and presented their findings transparently. The debates were genuine. The disagreements were argued in the open, with evidence. And over time, as the anomalies accumulated and the tools for analyzing them became more powerful, the field moved, not all at once, not without resistance, not without the kind of fierce, sometimes personal debate that has always characterized the cutting edge of science. But it moved. The Jebel Irhoud findings weren't suppressed. They were published in Nature, the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, and they were debated, scrutinized, tested, and ultimately accepted as genuine by the overwhelming majority of researchers in the field. The ancient DNA revolution, the sequencing of Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes, the discovery of ghost populations, the revelation of multiple interbreeding events, happened because researchers developed new tools, applied them rigorously, published their results, and subjected them to the most intense peer scrutiny in the field. When results were disputed, alternative analyses were performed. When replication studies supported the original findings, confidence increased. When they didn't, the original claims were revised. This is how science is supposed to work. And despite everything, despite the institutional inertia, the confirmation bias, the professional risks of challenging orthodoxy, it did work. The field updated, the consensus shifted, the story got closer to the truth. There's a particular moment in this process worth highlighting, because it illustrates better than almost anything else the character of science at its best. When Svante Pääbo's team first found Neanderthal DNA in modern human genomes, they didn't announce it triumphantly as proof that the out-of-Africa replacement model was wrong and their alternative view was right. They announced it as a finding, a surprising, significant, carefully validated finding, and they explicitly acknowledged that it challenged the prevailing consensus. They published their methods in full, so that other researchers could check their work. They noted the limitations of their analysis. They invited scrutiny. The scrutiny came hard. Other researchers examined the data, looked for alternative explanations, tested whether the Neanderthal sequences in modern genomes might be the product of ancient sequences retained from a common ancestor rather than actual interbreeding. The alternative explanations were tested and one by one found insufficient. The interbreeding interpretation held up. That process, publish openly, invite scrutiny, test alternatives, update conclusions based on evidence, is what distinguishes science from ideology. Ideologies don't welcome challenges. They suppress them, reframe them, or dismiss them without engagement. Science, at its best, does the opposite. It treats challenges as gifts, as opportunities to test ideas more rigorously and get closer to what's actually true. There's another aspect of this story worth examining: the role of new technologies in scientific revolutions. The transformation in human origins science didn't happen only because researchers looked at old evidence with fresh eyes. It happened, in large part, because entirely new tools became available that made previously impossible analysis routine. Ancient DNA sequencing is the most dramatic example. The ability to extract and read genetic information from bones tens or hundreds of thousands of years old, sidestepping the degradation and contamination challenges that had made ancient DNA research essentially impossible for most of the 20th century, opened up an entirely new window into human prehistory. It allowed researchers to ask questions that had previously been answerable only through physical fossil analysis and inference. Who were these people genetically? Were they related to living populations? Had they interbred with other groups? The answers that came back from ancient DNA studies didn't just add details to the existing picture. They fundamentally rewrote it. Similarly, advances in dating technology expanded what was possible. Techniques like thermoluminescence dating, optically stimulated luminescence, uranium series dating, and improvements in radiocarbon calibration made it possible to date materials that had previously resisted chronological placement and to date them with greater precision than ever before. The revision of dates at sites like Jebel Irhoud, from an initial estimate of around 160,000 years to the revised figure of 315,000 years, was made possible by the application of newer, more precise dating methods to materials that had been sitting in collections for decades, and computational advances made it possible to analyze genetic datasets of a size and complexity that would have been completely intractable just a generation ago. The demographic models that reveal deep population structure in African genomes, the statistical methods that detect ghost population admixture, the simulations that test whether observed patterns in genetic data are consistent with specific historical scenarios. All of these required computational power and analytical sophistication that simply didn't exist when the out of Africa theory was. First formulated technology didn't just help science advance, it changed what science was capable of knowing. What does all of this tell us about how to relate to scientific knowledge in general? It tells us that scientific consensus is valuable but not infallible, that the best supported theory at any given moment represents our best current understanding of the evidence, which is very different from a final, permanent truth. That anomalies deserve attention rather than dismissal. That technological advances can upend conclusions that seemed rock solid. That the willingness to revise, even dramatically, even publicly, even at the cost of prestigious reputations, is not a weakness of science, but its most fundamental strength. It tells us to hold scientific knowledge with a particular kind of intelligent humility, not the cheap skepticism that says, scientists have been wrong before, so I don't have to believe anything they say. That's not humility, it's an intellectual escape route that leads nowhere good. Real humility says, the current best understanding is worth taking seriously, worth acting on, worth respecting. And it's also worth continuing to test, continuing to question, and continuing to update as new evidence arrives. Scientific knowledge is not a fixed monument. It's a living process, always incomplete, always provisional, always pushing toward a horizon that retreats as you approach it. That's not a bug in the system. It's the feature that makes science work, and nowhere is that feature more visible, more dramatic, more consequential, more genuinely exciting than in the ongoing revolution in our understanding of where we came from. Which brings us, finally, to where that revolution is heading next. Somewhere right now, and I mean literally right now, as you watch this, there is a researcher crouched over a sediment layer in a cave, brushing soil away from something that has been waiting in the dark for 100,000 years. There is a laboratory technician running a sequencing protocol on a fragment of ancient bone, watching data accumulate on a screen that will eventually tell a story no living person has ever heard. There is a graduate student staring at a genetic dataset, noticing a pattern that doesn't fit the models, feeling the particular electric discomfort of realizing that the thing you're looking at might be important. These moments happen. They have been happening with increasing frequency, and the revelations they produce, the ones already published, the ones in review, the ones not yet written up, are going to reshape the human origin story in ways we can already glimpse, and in ways we cannot yet imagine. The revolution in human origins research isn't slowing down. If anything, it's accelerating. And understanding where it's heading, what questions are being asked, what tools are being applied, what discoveries are already half made, is one of the most genuinely thrilling intellectual exercises available to anyone curious about what it means to be human. So let's go there. Let's look at the horizon. The most significant technological frontier in human origins research right now is ancient DNA from Africa. You might be surprised to learn that, despite Africa being the continent where human evolution happened, it has been one of the hardest places in the world to recover ancient DNA from. The reason is climate. DNA preservation depends heavily on cold and dry conditions, which is why some of the best ancient DNA recoveries have come from Siberian caves, European permafrost, and the cold, arid conditions of sites like Denisovan Cave. Warm, humid, tropical environments, like those found across much of sub-Saharan Africa, accelerate the chemical degradation of DNA in bone to the point where, in most cases, nothing useful remains. After even a few thousand years, This has created a profound blind spot in our understanding of human evolutionary history. The continent, where the deepest, most important chapters of that history were written, is also the continent whose ancient genomes we've had the hardest time reading, but that's changing. Researchers have been developing techniques to extract and analyze ancient DNA from samples in which conventional methods find nothing, using improved extraction chemistry, more sensitive sequencing approaches, and better computational methods for assembling fragmentary sequences. And they've been finding, with increasing frequency, samples from African sites that yield usable genetic material. A landmark 2020 study recovered ancient DNA from individuals buried in Malawi dating back 8,100 years. The oldest African genome recovered to that point from sub-Saharan Africa. A 2022 study pushed further back, recovering genetic material from individuals in East Africa dating to around 5,000 years ago. Each successful recovery extends the window of direct genetic observation further into Africa's past. The target, the holy grail of ancient African DNA research, is the period between 20,000 and 100,000 years ago. That's the time frame during which modern human populations were diversifying and dispersing across Africa, the period that the Pan-African model focuses on, the era whose population dynamics most directly shaped the genetic landscape of modern Africans and through them all of humanity. If researchers can successfully recover and sequence ancient genomes from that period, from sites across the African continent, the current models of human origins will be tested in ways that could confirm them, refine them, or overturn them entirely. The ghost populations, those unnamed archaic groups whose DNA whispers through West and Central African genomes, might finally be identified. The patterns of migration and connection across the Green Sahara might be directly traced. The structure of ancient African populations might be mapped with a precision currently impossible. It's coming. The question is when and what it will show. Meanwhile, the fossil record is far from exhausted. One of the most consistent patterns in paleoanthropology is that major discoveries tend to come from places that aren't being intensively searched yet. East Africa has been heavily excavated for decades, and it has yielded extraordinary finds. But the investment in other regions has been considerably less systematic. West Africa, home to a substantial portion of the continent's current population, and according to genetic evidence, a region with deep and complex human evolutionary history, has been comparatively underexplored for fossils. The dense tropical soils, the difficulty of preservation in humid environments, and historically lower research investment have meant that our fossil knowledge of West African human prehistory is dramatically thinner than our knowledge of East and South Africa. This is beginning to change. Increased research investment, partnerships with West African institutions, and improved survey methods are expanding the search area. And the genetic evidence, suggesting deep ancient population structure and ghost population admixture in West African genomes, gives researchers reason to expect that significant fossil discoveries may be waiting in that region. Similarly, Central Africa, dominated by the Congo Basin's dense rainforest, represents an enormous geographic gap in the fossil record. The forest environment is devastating for bone preservation, but the margins of the forest, the river systems that wind through it, and the caves that occasionally punctuate the landscape all offer potential sites where preservation might be better than the general environment would suggest. And then there's the ocean floor, or rather the continental shelves that were dry land during glacial periods when sea levels were considerably lower than today. Significant portions of the coastlines of Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas, coastlines that were inhabited by early humans who predictably favored coastal environments for their rich food resources, are now submerged under tens of meters of seawater. Archaeological and fossil evidence from these regions is, for the most part, currently inaccessible. But advances in underwater archaeology and remote sensing are slowly extending the reach of research into submerged landscapes and what might be found there, evidence of early coastal human populations, trade networks, migration routes, could add entirely new dimensions to the human origin story. The questions that the next generation of research is positioned to answer are extraordinary in their scope and their implications. How many distinct ancient African populations contributed to the ancestry of modern humans? The current evidence suggests at least several, but the real number and the nature of their relationships is genuinely unknown. Answering this question requires the ancient DNA record from Africa that we're still building. What were the ghost populations? Where did they live? When did they diverge from the main human lineage? When did they interbreed with modern human ancestors? Were they physically distinctive enough that, if we found their fossils, we would recognize them as something different? Or do they look similar enough to early Homo sapiens that their remains have been sitting in museum collections, misidentified, for decades? This last possibility isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. The Denisovans were identified not by recognizing an unusual fossil, but by sequencing DNA from a fragment that looked, to the untrained eye, like an unremarkable piece of bone. There may well be Denisovan equivalent discoveries waiting. Ancient human groups detectable only through genetics, their physical remains already collected but unrecognized in collections accumulated over a century of fossil hunting. The systematic application of ancient DNA analysis to existing museum collections, bones already excavated, already catalogued, already sitting in drawers, is a research program that could produce revelations without digging a single new site. What was the relationship between behavioral and anatomical modernity? Did the development of modern cognitive capacities, language, symbolic thought, complex social organization happen at the same time and place as the development of modern anatomy? Or were there anatomically archaic populations behaving in cognitively modern ways, or anatomically modern populations whose behavioral repertoire was still developing? The interplay between biology and culture in human evolution is one of the deepest unresolved questions in the field, and the new data coming in from multiple directions is slowly, tantalizingly, beginning to sketch the outlines of an answer. Perhaps the most important shift in the field, though, is not about any specific discovery or any particular technology. It's conceptual. The researchers at the frontier of human origin science are no longer asking, where did modern humans come from, as if it were a question with a single, locatable answer. They're asking a richer, more honest set of questions. How did the diverse human populations of ancient Africa interact across hundreds of thousands of years? What were the mechanisms of gene flow that connected them? How did environmental change drive population movement and mixing? How did modern traits, anatomical, cognitive, behavioral, spread and consolidate across a networked set of populations rather than arising in a single location? These are harder questions. They require more data, more sophisticated methods, more intellectual humility. They don't resolve into a single red dot on a museum map, but they resolve into something far more valuable. A genuine understanding of the actual, historical process by which our species came into being. And that process, the more clearly we see it, turns out to be one of the most remarkable things that has ever happened on this planet. A species emerging not from a single place, but from a continent-wide conversation between populations, absorbing genes from other human groups, Neanderthals, Denisovans, unnamed others, and incorporating those genes into a biology that became stronger, more adaptable, better equipped for the extraordinary range of environments it would go on to inhabit. Spreading across the globe not in a single clean wave, but in multiple pulses and explorations, over hundreds of thousands of years, driven by curiosity and climate, and the deep human restlessness that has always pushed us toward the next horizon. Eventually building fires on every continent, eventually painting cave walls, planting seeds, raising cities, asking questions about stars and atoms and the nature of consciousness itself, eventually developing the science that allowed us to look back at our own origins and begin slowly, imperfectly, magnificently to understand them. The story of where we came from is still being written. Every fossil pulled from the earth adds a sentence. Every genome sequenced adds a paragraph. Every careful, rigorous study that tests a hypothesis and reports honestly on what it finds, whether that supports the current model or challenges it, adds another page to a story that has been unfolding for hundreds of thousands of years and will continue unfolding for as long as there are humans curious enough to ask. We don't know how the next chapter goes, but we know it's coming. And whatever it reveals, whatever surprises the Earth and the genome and the analytical ingenuity of future researchers will produce, it will almost certainly be stranger, richer, and more wonderful than anything we currently expect. The mystery is far from solved. In many ways, it's barely begun. Let's come back to that museum, the one with the map on the wall, the red dot over East Africa, the arrows sweeping outward to Europe, Asia, Australia, the Americas. Clean, simple, certain. You see it differently now, don't you? Not because the map is entirely wrong. It still points to something real and important, a genuine pattern in the story of how humans spread across the world. But because you now understand what it leaves out, the 315,000 years of human history before the arrows start. The multiple populations spread across an entire continent, slowly, haltingly, magnificently converging towards something we would eventually recognize as ourselves. The Neanderthal and Denisovan and unknown archaic ancestors whose genes are woven right now into the fabric of living human bodies. The multiple migrations, the pulses and retreats, the failed ventures and the successful ones, the bidirectional flows of people and genes between Africa and the wider world. The map shows you the surface, the science, the new science, the messy, complicated, endlessly surprising science, shows you the depth. And what a depth it is. Here is what strikes me most after following this evidence wherever it leads. The human origin story, the real one, the full one, is not a story about one people in one place at one moment. It's a story about connection, about the extraordinary, persistent, biologically encoded human tendency to reach across every gap and find another person on the other side. We carry Neanderthal DNA because, somewhere in the Middle East, perhaps 60,000 years ago, two groups of people who had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years found each other again, and, instead of fighting or fleeing, some of them stayed, built fires together, had children together. Those children survived. Those genes persisted. They're in your body right now, possibly helping your immune system recognize a pathogen, possibly influencing how your skin responds to UV radiation, possibly doing something we haven't yet identified. We carry the genetic echoes of unnamed, unknowable ghost populations because our ancestors, wherever they went, kept encountering others, kept mixing, kept absorbing, kept being changed by the people they met. There was never a moment when humanity was sealed off from itself, never a period of pure isolation that produced a pure type. We have always been a species in conversation, across distances, across differences, across the impossible gaps of time and geography that separated populations for thousands of years at a stretch. This is what the science is telling us. Not that we're all the same, we're not, and pretending otherwise doesn't serve truth or justice. But that we're all connected in ways that are real and deep and written in the very molecules of our cells. That every human being alive today is the product of an unimaginably complex web of ancestral connections stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, crossing every geographical and biological boundary that ever separated our predecessors. I want to say something directly to you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. Whatever your background, whatever community you grew up in, whatever story you were told about where you come from, your actual origins are richer and stranger and more connected to the rest of humanity than any simple story can capture. You are not just your immediate ancestry, your nationality, your ethnicity, your community. You are the endpoint of hundreds of thousands of years of human movement, encounter, adaptation, and survival. Your genome is a palimpsest, layer after layer of ancestral story written over each other, going back to a time before our species had a name, before there were words for what we were or where we were going. That's not an abstraction. It's biology. It's in you. Science, at its best, does something more than explain the physical world. It changes how we see ourselves in it. And the new science of human origins, with all its complexity, all its unsettling revisions to stories we thought were settled, all its revelations about how deeply and persistently we have always been connected to each other, does exactly that. It asks us to hold our certainties a little more lightly, to be curious about the anomalies rather than dismissive of them, to remember that the story we currently have is always incomplete, that there are bones in the earth and genomes in living people and patterns in ancient sediments that we haven't read yet, and that, when we read them, the story will get richer and stranger and more human than it already is. It asks us to look at another person, any other person, anywhere on earth, and recognize that however different they look from us, however far their ancestors' journey took them from ours, somewhere deep in the past, those journeys shared a common thread, many common threads, woven together across distances and differences that would have seemed insurmountable into the single extraordinary species that stands here now asking questions about its own beginnings. The mystery of human origins is not solved, it's barely begun, and that's not cause for frustration, it's cause for wonder, because every unsolved mystery is an invitation. Every unanswered question is a door left open. Every gap in the fossil record is a place where the next extraordinary discovery might be waiting. Somewhere, the evidence is already there. Locked in a bone buried in sediment. Written in the genome of a living person who doesn't yet know what their DNA contains. Waiting in a cave that no researcher has yet entered, or in a museum collection that hasn't yet been analyzed with the latest tools, the next revelation is coming. And when it arrives, when it rewrites another piece of the story, when it forces another revision, when it makes the picture richer and more complicated and more true, I hope you'll be ready to receive it with the same openness and wonder that the evidence deserves. Because this is your story, the most personal story there is. Where you came from, what you're made of, who you've always been. If this journey through deep time has sparked something in you, a question, a conversation you want to have, a corner of this vast subject you want to explore further, then share this with someone. Not because I need the views, but because this story deserves to be told. Around dinner tables, in classrooms, between strangers on long flights who discover they share a curiosity about the oldest question humans have ever asked. The mystery continues, the journey goes on. And we're all still walking it together.